Champlain Towers South. On June 24, 2021, at the 12-story Champlain Towers South condominium on Collins Avenue in Surfside, Florida, the lobby was quiet and the night shift was settled in. It was just past 1:15 in the morning. Stacy Dawn Fang, 54, lived with her 15-year-old son, Jonah Handler, in apartment 1002 on the 10th floor. They had been asleep when, at 1:14 a.m., the pool deck of the building suddenly suffered a partial collapse. Security guard Shamoka Furman, working the overnight lobby shift, heard a boom. At 1:16, she called 911 to report what she described as an explosion. A minute later, she called police back and called it an earthquake. At 1:22 a.m., the central section and the entire eastern wing of the 12-story tower suffered a progressive collapse, pancaking floor onto floor and dropping 98 people into a heap of concrete and twisted steel. Miami-Dade Fire Rescue urban search and rescue crews reached the pile within minutes. Stacy Fang was pulled from the rubble alive, but died of her injuries shortly after arriving at the hospital, becoming the first victim publicly identified. Her son Jonah was rescued that morning, along with 3 others, including 16-year-old Devin Gonzalez, who had fallen more than 60 feet onto debris. Engineering consultants who had inspected the building in 2018 had flagged long-term degradation of reinforced concrete structural support in the basement-level parking garage under the pool deck, due to water penetration and corrosion of reinforcing steel. Those problems had been noted as much worse in April 2021, 2 months before the collapse. Federal investigators at the National Institute of Standards and Technology concluded the building had not been constructed to code. The death toll reached 98, making the Champlain Towers South collapse one of the deadliest structural failures in American history. The remaining standing portion of the tower was demolished 10 days later. A class action settlement of approximately $1.2 billion was approved by a Miami-Dade Circuit Court judge in June 2022 for the families of the victims and the survivors. ValuJet Flight 590. On May 11, 1996, a DC-9 taxied at Miami International Airport bound for Atlanta. Just past 2 p.m., the temperature was in the mid-80s and the runway shimmered. Captain Candlin Kubek, 35, was at the controls with First Officer Richard Hazen, 52, beside her. The flight carried 105 passengers and 3 flight attendants, all booked on a budget carrier that had been operating for less than 3 years. About 6 minutes after takeoff, the cockpit voice recorder caught a sharp sound, and a passenger shouted that there was fire in the cabin. Smoke began pouring through the cockpit door. Kubek radioed Miami Air Traffic Control to request an immediate return to the airport. The flight banked back toward Miami International as smoke filled the cabin and main electrical systems began failing. Roughly 10 minutes after takeoff, the DC-9 entered an uncontrolled descent and impacted the Everglades at a steep angle, striking the swamp at high speed. The aircraft and its 110 occupants were obliterated on impact. First responders from Miami-Dade Fire Rescue and the Coast Guard reached the crash site within hours, finding the wreckage submerged in roughly 6 feet of murky water and sawgrass. There were no survivors. Body recovery in the alligator-infested swamp took weeks. Investigators determined the fire had been started by improperly stored chemical oxygen generators in the forward cargo hold. The generators had been shipped by ValuJet's maintenance contractor, SaberTech, and labeled as empty when they were live. 3 SaberTech employees were indicted in 1999, and SaberTech itself was convicted of 9 counts of criminal hazardous materials violation. Mechanic Mauro Valenzuela fled before trial and remains a fugitive decades later. The Federal Aviation Administration shut ValuJet down on June 17, 1996, after a 30-day investigation uncovered serious deficiencies in maintenance, repair documentation, and safety directive compliance. The crash forced Congress to strip the FAA of its dual mandate, ending the agency's responsibility to promote the airline industry and refocusing it solely on safety. Hurricane Ian, Fort Myers drowning. On September 28, 2022, on Estero Island in Fort Myers Beach, Florida, Hurricane Ian was bearing down on the southwest coast as a Category 4 storm, with sustained winds near 150 miles per hour. Ilanka Neese, 82 according to the Lee County Sheriff's Office, lived alone in a home on Estero Island. She had stayed behind as the storm approached the barrier island. Around 3 p.m. that afternoon, Ian made landfall near Cayo Costa, pushing a storm surge of more than 10 feet into Fort Myers Beach. Water rose through ground floors of homes within minutes. Estero Island was inundated as the surge swept houses off their foundations and carried debris and people into the mangroves and across the bay. Communications were cut off across Lee County. Neese was carried from her home by the surge. She was never seen alive again. Family members requested a welfare check on October 7th, about a week after the hurricane, but deputies could not find her. She was officially declared missing on October 15th, after several failed attempts to locate her. A debris removal crew clearing the mangroves on Estero Island found human remains in January 2023, roughly 0.16 of a mile from Neese's home. The Lee County medical examiner identified the remains as Neese through dental records and ruled the cause of death accidental drowning. Neese was one of more than 50 Hurricane Ian fatalities in Lee County alone, and one of 149 confirmed Florida deaths attributed to the storm. Sunshine Skyway Bridge collapse. On May 9, 1980, in Tampa Bay, Florida, a heavy squall was rolling across the water just after 7:30 in the morning. Visibility had collapsed into near-zero rain. The phosphate freighter Summit Venture, 608 feet of empty ballast on its way to the port of Tampa, was being navigated through the narrow shipping channel by harbor pilot John E. Laro. As Laro tried to make a required turn in the channel, the radar failed during the squall. Visibility dropped to nothing. Driving blind in heavy rain, the 608-foot freighter drifted off course and struck a support pier on the southbound span of the original Sunshine Skyway Bridge. A 1,400-foot section of the steel cantilever bridge collapsed into Tampa Bay. A Greyhound bus, a pickup truck, and 6 passenger vehicles fell 165 feet into the water. 35 people died, 26 of them on the Greyhound bus. Coast Guard and local rescue crews reached the wreckage in the bay within minutes. Wesley McIntyre, whose Ford Courier pickup landed on the freighter's deck rather than in the water, was the sole survivor. The NTSB found that radar failure in the squall, combined with the narrow channel, caused the freighter to strike the pier. A state grand jury cleared pilot John Laro of wrongdoing, and a Coast Guard inquiry reached the same finding. The current Bob Graham Sunshine Skyway Bridge opened in 1987 with extensive safety upgrades. The channel was widened, the bridge was elevated, and large concrete dolphin barriers were installed to absorb future ship strikes. Laro was haunted by the disaster for the rest of his life. He died in 2002 of multiple sclerosis, having spent decades insisting he had done everything he could in those final seconds in the squall. Lake Kissimmee alligator attack. On May 6, 2025, on Tiger Creek near Lake Kissimmee State Park in Polk County, Florida, a canoe was gliding through brown water about 2.5 feet. The waterway was known alligator habitat. Cynthia K. Diekema, 61, of Davenport, was paddling with her husband Dave. The couple had launched their canoe shortly before the attack. As the canoe passed over an alligator measuring 11 feet 4 inches, the gator thrashed beneath. The sudden movement sent both Diekema and her husband into the water. She was immediately bitten on the torso as she went under. The alligator performed a death roll, clamped onto her midsection, and swam away with her. Dave tried for several minutes to pry her loose, but couldn't. Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission officers responded to this. About 20 minutes into their search, officers found Diekema's body and declared her dead at the scene. FWC officers located the 11-foot 4-inch alligator and euthanized it around 7:30 p.m. that same day. The Polk County medical examiner attributed the death to traumatic injuries inflicted by the alligator. Diekema's death marked one of 31 fatal alligator attacks documented in Florida since 1948. Seffner sinkhole. On the night of February 28, 2013, in Seffner, an unincorporated suburb east of Tampa, Florida, a single-story blue 1970s-era house at 240 Faithway Drive was settled in for the night. It was just before 11 p.m. Jeffrey Bush, 36, was asleep in his bedroom. His brother Jeremy and 4 other family members, including a 2-year-old child, were also inside the home. The floor of the bedroom suddenly gave way as a sinkhole roughly 30 feet wide opened opened directly beneath the bed. Jeff plunged dozens of feet into the earth as the sinkhole widened. From elsewhere in the house, Jeremy heard his brother screaming. Jeremy ran to the bedroom, but found that almost the entire room had vanished into the hole. He jumped into the pit himself and dug at the rubble with a shovel. Hillsborough County deputies arrived and pulled Jeremy out of the unstable hole as the floor was still collapsing. Engineers concluded the cavity was too deep and too dangerous to retrieve Jeff's body. Jeremy and the 4 other family members escaped. The house was demolished and the lot was sealed. Bush's remains were never recovered. The Hillsborough County Medical Examiner formally ruled him deceased. The sinkhole has reopened on the same lot 3 times since 2013, in 2015, 2017, and 2023, each time a fresh reminder of what is still underneath. Eastern Airlines Flight 401. On December 29, 1972, on final approach to Miami International Airport, the night was clear. The Lockheed L-1011 TriStar was descending toward the runway over the dark Everglades just before 11:45 p.m. Captain Bob Loft, 55, a veteran Eastern Airlines pilot, was in command. With him were First Officer Albert Stocks, 39, and Flight Engineer Don Repo, 51. They had 163 passengers and 10 flight attendants on board, including 25-year-old Beverly Raposa. As the TriStar set up for approach, the landing gear indicator light for the nose gear failed to illuminate green. The crew began troubleshooting the bulb. While Stock still worked on the bulb, Loft inadvertently bumped the yoke. The bump switched the autopilot out of altitude hold mode. The aircraft began a slow, almost imperceptible descent. For 4 minutes, all 3 crew members focused on the indicator light. The TriStar descended into the Everglades and struck the swamp at approximately 170 knots, breaking apart and scattering wreckage across the sawgrass. Coast Guard helicopters and airboats reached the crash site through the dark Everglades within an hour. All 3 cockpit crew members, 2 of the 10 flight attendants, and 96 of 163 passengers were killed. 75 people survived, including 58 with serious injuries. Beverly Raposa was among them. The NTSB determined the probable cause was the failure of the flight crew to monitor the flight instruments during the final 4 minutes of flight. Preoccupation with a malfunction of the nose landing gear position indicator distracted the crew from the altitude warning system. The autopilot had quietly disengaged from altitude hold when Loft bumped the yoke, and the chime that should have alerted them to the descent went unnoticed. The crash became one of the foundational case studies in aviation safety, directly prompting the development of crew resource management training programs that became industry standard worldwide. On December 29, 2022, on the 50th anniversary of the crash, Beverly Raposa unveiled a permanent memorial near the Curtis Mansion in Miami Springs, honoring the 101 people who died. FIU pedestrian bridge collapse. On March 15, 2018, over Southwest 8th Street in Sweetwater, Florida, on the campus of Florida International University, a 175-foot pedestrian bridge sat across the busy boulevard. It was just past 1:30 in the afternoon. The bridge had been installed 5 days earlier and was undergoing stress testing while 6 lanes of traffic flowed beneath it. Alexa Duran, 18, an FIU student, was driving home from a doctor's appointment with her best friend in the passenger seat. She was stopped at a red light directly under the span. Earlier that morning, at around 9 a.m., a university employee under the bridge had heard a loud whip-cracking sound, and the design-build team had met for roughly 2 hours to discuss cracks first discovered on March 10th. The bridge had not been closed to traffic. At 1:47 p.m., the 175-foot main span suddenly broke away from its supports and crashed onto the cars below. 8 vehicles were crushed. 6 people died, including Duran. 5 were motorists pinned in their vehicles, and 1 was a construction worker on the span. 10 others were injured, 6 of them serious. Miami-Dade Fire Rescue and Sweetwater Police reached the wreckage within minutes and began cutting people from the crushed cars. The National Transportation Safety Board determined the collapse was caused by a design error. Engineers had miscalculated the shear strength of the joint connecting the walkway surface to the truss that held it up. Inadequate independent peer review and a weak response to warnings before the collapse were named as contributing factors. Fig Bridge Engineers, the project's design firm, was barred from federal projects for 10 years by the Federal Highway Administration. A settlement totaling $102.7 million was paid to the families of the victims and the survivors. If you appreciate documentation like this, consider subscribing and tell me what to cover next in the comments.